If you've been looking for a DAC and headphone amp on a budget, you've probably come across the FX Audio DAC X6. It has been for a while a solid recommendation for those looking for a simple setup for very little outlay. The DAC X6 was a very simple DAC and amp combo, and that was it. No other bells or whistles or frills, just that. But now there is a successor, the DAC X6 Mark II. This one even has a few more features, including Bluetooth, which is pretty impressive for just $80. But is it any good? Well, let's get into it. Hey guys, this is Noel and this is Wheezy Tech. Each week I take a look at a thing and let you know what I think, so if you're into that kind of stuff then make sure you subscribe and ring in that notification bell, that also helps out too. In the interest of full disclosure, the DAC X6 Mark II was sent to me by Hifi College for the purposes of this review. As always, whether I pay for something myself or get sent a review sample, I'm always going to give you my honest take on them. Also, as usual, there's going to be timestamps in the description if you want to skip to any specific section. And with all that said, let's just get straight on with the review. Unlike some other well-known and more expensive offerings, the DAC X6 Mark II uses an all-metal chassis. It doesn't have the solid feel of the likes of the Hifi Zen DAC, it is instead quite light and obviously made from a much thinner metal shell, but it is nice to see metal being used here rather than plastic. Up front there is a power switch, and you need to hold this for about a second to turn on the unit. Tapping this button also serves as an input selector switch, cycling through the Bluetooth, USB, optical and coaxial inputs. In the middle there is the 1/4-inch headphone jack. On my unit there seems to be a little bit of play in the jack, perhaps it is not fully tightened to the chassis inside. That's not a good look, but there are obviously going to be a few compromises in a device built to this price point. On the right there is a volume knob. This also doubles as a mute button by pressing on the knob. The volume control itself is stepped rather than smooth, and each step seems to be a random volume increment somewhere between 0.5 and 1 dB per step. To the left of the knob there are a series of blue LEDs. When switching the sampling rates, these LEDs indicate the current sample rate, and they also double as volume indicators when turning the volume control. That's a nice little touch. Over on the rear we have our inputs. On the left we have the Bluetooth antenna, you have a USB-B connector, a Toslink optical connector and a coaxial connector. To the right we have the RCA line outputs. These are variable outputs which are volume controlled by the knob on the front. This allows the DAC X6 Mark II to be used as a preamp for active speakers. On the far right hand side there is the barrel connector for your power, this one taking 12V DC from the included power supply. Also included is a USB-A to USB-B cable and a 3.5mm to 1/4-inch adapter. So let's just quickly go over the specs to add a little bit more context to the I/O and features. On screen I'll put the various specs and the chips that are in use for the nerds that care about those things, and the interesting one to note is the use of a single DAC chip, the ESS9018, which supports sample rates of up to 24-bit and 192 kHz. More interesting is that in use the USB option appears in Windows as a SPDIF device, and that is really quite unusual for a USB DAC. In terms of Bluetooth connection, the DAC X6 Mark II uses Bluetooth 5 with SBC, AAC and aptX codec support. And speaking of the Bluetooth, I'll be honest, I never put a huge amount of time into testing the Bluetooth performance. I'm perhaps not alone in this, but I don't really see the point in having Bluetooth input on an amp like this. If this did have a remote, you could use it as a preamp for speakers across the room, and that would make some sense. And the only other scenario that comes to mind is having this on your desk at work with a pair of headphones, and when you get into work you can just pair your phone to it. Hey, I'm sure there is a market for this, it's just not something that I find particularly useful at all. Finally, according to the spec sheet, the max power output is 940mW at 16 ohms. That's a little bit less than the Atom, but it is pretty decent and fine for driving most headphones except for the most exotic ones out there. If you're buying an amp at this price, the chances are you don't own one of those exotic headphones, so yes, this will drive your headphones with no problem. Let's talk about how the X6 Mark II sounds, as I'm sure that's all a lot of you care about. So what can I say? Well, it has no coloration or character of its own, so in that regard it's a transparent sounding amplifier, ideal for hearing music as it was produced without added flavour. On that note, people vastly overstate the differences between amps, especially DACs, and most of that is due to volume matching and bias, unconscious or otherwise, to a certain extent. It really does not take much of a volume difference to perceive a difference in sound, and that is just the way our ears work. We perceive louder sounds to be better. Of course, this is also complicated by the fact that some amps do actually have their own character, but usually that's a design choice rather than something that came about naturally. For those that don't yet know my testing methodology, I don't just trust what I think I can hear and instead attempt to remove all bias and potential volume mismatching. I only ever make any judgment after blind volume match testing. I compare them to my usual amp, both match to the same volume. I mix up the cables so I don't know which is which. I run them both through a switcher and I see if I can tell the difference between them. Now, even if I do think I can hear a difference, I need to replicate that and point to that difference more than 50% of the time. Otherwise, it's just a coin toss and it's not significant. That doesn't mean that I don't hear differences, but that if it cannot be reliably replicated, then it is either not significant or it could be imagined. And either way, frankly, it is irrelevant to the average consumer. In this particular case, I compared the DAC X6 MKII to my JDS Atom using the Motu M4 as a DAC, which also uses an ESS DAC chip. I also used a variety of headphones and genres from lossless sources, and I couldn't hear any significant difference with these headphones. I did at one point think that the Atom was a little less compressed and had a slightly wider staging, but I was unable to replicate that with any degree of confidence. My conclusion then is whatever the differences there are, if there are any, are functionally insignificant and largely irrelevant, especially at this price point. However, testing with sensitive IEMs did highlight that the X6 MKII does have a significantly higher noise floor than the JDS Atom. And in fact, even when not doing back-to-back comparison, this noise floor is quite noticeable in ordinary use. Unfortunately, this is probably a deal breaker for those using IEMs. If you're using headphones, you are less likely to notice this, and how much of a difference this actually makes to people buying at this price point, I guess that's debatable, and it's something that you're going to have to decide for yourself. And I think that really just about brings us on to the value and conclusion section. And if you are looking for a budget DAC and amp combo for around about $80 or less, you don't really have a huge range of choice, especially not with such a rich feature set. So whilst the DAC X6 MKII is nothing special, it does represent excellent value for this price point. Sure, despite being made of metal, it does feel very light and cheap, the 1/4-inch jack is wobbly, and the noise floor is a little bit higher than I would like to see. But certainly, this is very likely to be a step up from onboard audio on your PC. It's definitely better than any onboard audio that I've had on any of my motherboards over the years. It could be argued that you are probably better off saving up for something a little bit more high-end, perhaps an Hifi Zen DAC or one of the popular mini stacks like the Topping E30 and L30, the JDS Atom, or the Shit Magni and Modi stacks. However, most of those other options are gonna set you back probably around $100 or more, or around $50 more in the case of the highly recommended Hifi Zen DAC. However, whilst this might not be endgame, and who would expect that for $80, if you are looking for something to get you started on a tight budget, I think that the DAC X6 MKII is a very, very fine choice as an upgrade from onboard audio. Just as long as you're aware of the limitations. Right, that's going to be it then. Thank you so much to Hifi College for sending this over to me to check out. There will be links in the description for where to buy. Now make sure that you like and subscribe and all of that business. Check the cards for other relevant content, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, have a good one.